The crumbling entrance to the amusement park stood like a dark relic from a bygone era, its once vibrant colors dulled by years of neglect. The iron gates, now rusted and twisted, creaked in the wind as if protesting their abandonment. The towering roller coaster in the distance loomed as a forgotten giant, its tracks bent and shattered, left to decay. For years, the park had been closed, its glory days long gone. But even in its decrepit state, there was something strangely magnetic about the place. Something that drew people like moths to a flame, a sense of mystery, perhaps, or the remnants of a time when it had been a haven of joy and laughter. Now, it was a hollow shell, a ghost of what it used to be. The town surrounding the park had grown up around it, but few residents dared venture near the gates anymore. The stories of strange noises, flickering lights, and eerie sounds carried on the wind had kept people at bay. It had become a place of whispered legends, where children dared each other to go inside, but always came back with a mixture of fear and fascination in their eyes. Adults, on the other hand, viewed it as a cursed place, a reminder of something they couldn't quite explain but would rather not try to understand. As I stood before the rusting gates, a mixture of curiosity and trepidation swirled within me. My name is Alex, and I had lived in this town all my life, hearing the stories about the park but never truly believing them. That was until the day I found an old photograph in my grandmother's attic. It was a black and white image of the amusement park in its prime, with families smiling and rides bustling with energy. But what struck me the most was the woman standing at the entrance, a figure in a faded coat who seemed strangely out of place. Her eyes, dark and intense, stared directly at the camera as if she knew something no one else did. Something about that image haunted me. In the weeks that followed, I found myself unable to shake the feeling that I had to visit the park. Something was drawing me there, pulling me toward the mystery of that photograph. I had no idea what I was looking for, but deep down, I knew that I needed to understand the connection between the woman in the photo and the park's eerie history. On this particular afternoon, I had gathered enough courage to venture through the overgrown path leading to the gates. The wind howled as I approached, the faint sound of rusted metal scraping against itself echoing through the trees. The gates were locked, but the padlock had long since rusted through, offering me an easy way inside. With a nervous breath, I pushed the gates open, and the sound of their creaking seemed to reverberate in my bones. The air inside the park was thick with the smell of decay. The once immaculate pathways were now choked with weeds and overgrowth. The remnants of old ticket booths stood like hollow sentinels, their windows boarded up and glass shattered. The empty space felt suffocating, as if the park were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Yet, there was a strange stillness to the place, an unsettling quiet that only amplified the eerie atmosphere. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing in the distance as I took in the derelict surroundings. The carousel, once a symbol of joy, now stood broken and still, its horses frozen in mid-gallop, their paint chipped and cracked. The Ferris wheel towered above me, its cabins swaying in the breeze, despite being long out of commission. In the distance, the roller coaster tracks seemed to stretch into infinity, twisting and bending like the skeletal remains of a long-dead creature. As I explored, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every now and then, I would hear a faint sound, perhaps the wind, or maybe something more, a soft tapping, a distant murmur, or the occasional rustling of leaves. I paused, straining my ears, but each time, there was nothing. It was as though the park itself was alive, watching, waiting. The sensation of being observed was overwhelming, but I couldn't pinpoint the source. It was like the park's decaying walls were filled with secrets, and they were all desperate to be uncovered. I made my way to the old funhouse, the mirrored entrance now cracked and broken. The windows, once filled with laughter and the reflections of children playing, now stared out blankly. Stepping inside, I was greeted by a strange coldness. The air felt damp, thick with the scent of mildew and dust. The mirrors, once a source of amusement, now distorted reality, twisting my reflection into grotesque shapes. A sharp chill ran down my spine, and I quickly moved through the hall, my steps echoing in the eerie silence. The deeper I went, the more I began to feel the weight of the past pressing in on me. This place, once a sanctuary of joy, now felt like a tomb. The walls, cracked and weathered, seemed to be closing in, and the shadows grew longer as the sun began to set. I didn't know how much time had passed, but something had shifted. The air, once stagnant, now hummed with an electric tension, as though the very land beneath me had come alive. As I emerged from the funhouse, I looked back toward the entrance, feeling the heavy gaze of the park upon me. The gates were still open, but they seemed more ominous now. The photograph I had found in my grandmother's attic came rushing back to me. The woman in the faded coat, her haunting eyes, her connection to this place. Had she known something I didn't? Was there a secret buried deep within the park? Something that could explain its eerie stillness? The forgotten gates of the amusement park loomed ahead, no longer just a relic of the past, but a door to something far darker. I had crossed the threshold, and I knew there was no turning back. What secrets lay hidden within the park's decaying walls? And more importantly, what had I just awakened? As I stood at the edge of the disused amusement park, a strange unease settled over me. The once familiar feeling of curiosity had shifted to something darker. The park, now abandoned and decaying, felt as though it had been waiting for me. There was an odd stillness in the air, as though time itself had ceased to move in this place. Every creaking of metal, every gust of wind, seemed to carry a hidden message, a warning or perhaps an invitation. I couldn't tell which, but the feeling of being watched was palpable. I had already wandered through much of the park, but now, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the place transformed. The shadows grew deeper, and the once muted colors of the rides took on a sickly hue in the fading light. The Ferris wheel, which had appeared a relic of the past, now loomed like a colossal skeleton in the background. Its unmoving structure seemed almost defiant, as if daring anyone to venture too close. Yet, despite the creeping fear, something kept pulling me further into its depths. I found myself near the carousel again, where the cracked horses stood frozen in time. Each one seemed to wear a permanent expression of joy, their wide eyes staring into nothingness. The soft whine of the wind that passed through their hollow eyes felt like a ghostly breath, lingering and unsettling. As I stood there, unable to tear my gaze from the twisted animals, I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible above the rustling of the leaves, but it was unmistakable. The voice seemed to come from the carousel itself, as though it was woven into the very fabric of the park. I froze, straining my ears to catch the words. The whisper seemed to drift, shifting with the wind, like a melody that could not be fully heard. It was disjointed, fragmented, snippets of sentences, half-formed thoughts. Not alone. The one who watches, waiting. The voice was cold and hollow, like the echo of a forgotten memory. The chill in the air intensified, and I instinctively took a step back. The wind picked up, and the whisper was lost, replaced by the mournful groan of the Ferris wheel's long-abandoned structure. Had I imagined it? The rational part of me fought to dismiss the idea, to cling to the belief that the park's eerie atmosphere was simply a product of my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew that something more was at play here. The feeling of being observed had intensified since I first crossed the gates, and now, I was certain that I wasn't alone. The very ground beneath my feet felt haunted, as though every inch of it was saturated with forgotten secrets and whispered stories of those who had come before me. I continued my journey through the park, the unease growing with each step. My feet crunched on the overgrown pathways, the sounds of my movement echoing unervingly in the quiet air. The further I went, the more it felt like the park was closing in around me. The once grand buildings and rides that had once been filled with laughter now stood as hollow shells, their purpose lost to time. It was as though the joy had been drained from the place, leaving only the shadows behind. As I approached the old ticket booth, I noticed something peculiar. The dust and dirt on the windows had been disturbed, and a faint outline of a handprint was visible on the glass. It was fresh, too fresh. I pressed my face closer to the window, trying to make sense of the faint markings, but the inside was pitch black. A sudden, sharp sound broke the silence, a low, guttural growl. My heart raced, and I stumbled backward, knocking into the frame of the booth. I quickly turned, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing, just the empty expanse of the park stretching out before me. I stood there for a moment, my breath shallow, my body tensed. The growl had felt too real, too alive. My mind raced to explain it, to rationalize the sound, but nothing came to mind. The wind had died down, and once again, there was silence. But this silence felt different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a forgotten place. It was the silence of something waiting, something watching. I felt a strange compulsion to look up at the towering roller coaster that loomed above me, its tracks stretching far into the sky. I couldn't explain it, but there was something about the roller coaster that felt significant. It had always been a part of the park's identity, its centerpiece, its crowning glory. Yet now, it seemed like a dark sentinel, its towering structure intimidating and oppressive. As I stood there, gazing up at it, the whispers returned. This time they were clearer, more distinct. "It's here. You've come too far. The ride never ends." The words sent a chill through my entire body. I felt a growing sense of dread, an urge to turn and run. But something stopped me, something anchored me to the spot. The whispers seemed to be drawing me toward the roller coaster, pulling me into its shadow. I could feel the eyes of the park on me, and for the first time, I realized that this place was not abandoned. It was alive, alive with memories, alive with fears, alive with something far darker than I could comprehend. The air grew heavy with the weight of the unknown, and I knew then that I had stumbled into something far beyond my understanding. The amusement park was not just a place. It was a living entity, one that was aware of my presence, and it was drawing me deeper into its depths. What awaited me at the end of the ride? Only time would tell. The roller coaster stood before me like a dark sentinel, its towering structure seemingly shifting in the dim light. The shadows of the twisted tracks stretched out across the park like fingers, clawing at the air, beckoning me forward. The whispers that had echoed in my mind moments ago seemed to linger in the silence, reverberating within the deep crevices of my thoughts. The ride never ends. The words refuse to leave me, growing louder with each passing second, filling the empty space with an unsettling tension. I could feel my heartbeat quicken, my breath becoming shallow as the temptation to uncover whatever secret lay hidden in the shadows of this forsaken place gnawed at me. I had already begun to question my reasons for being here. What was I truly hoping to find in this decaying amusement park? Was it the mystery of the woman in the photograph that had drawn me here? Was it a need to confront the growing sense of dread that seemed to follow me like a shadow? Or had the park, with its strange whispers and dark allure, planted something far more insidious within me? It was as though the place had a life of its own, something dark and ancient, hungry for whatever it was I had brought with me. Compelled by forces beyond my control, I moved toward the entrance of the roller coaster, my steps tentative but resolute. The air grew colder with every footstep, and I noticed how the ground beneath me felt uneven, as though the earth itself was shifting. The path, once clearly defined, had become jagged and twisted, leading me into the labyrinth of metal and rust that had once been a marvel of engineering. There was no sign of life, no hint of movement, just the oppressive weight of something unseen, pressing against me, urging me forward. The platform of the roller coaster was eerily silent as I approached. The cars, once vibrant and inviting, now stood like lifeless shells, their bright colors faded and peeling. I hesitated at the edge of the platform, my hands trembling as I reached for the rusted bar of one of the ride's cars. The whispers grew stronger, as though they were coming from the very tracks themselves. They urged me to board, to ride, to face whatever awaited me at the end. There was no way back now. Every step I had taken, every turn I had made, had led me here. The ride would not let me leave until I had completed it. With a trembling breath, I climbed into one of the cars. As I sat down, I felt the cold metal bite into my skin, the chill of the park seeming to seep into my very bones. The restraint bar clamped down with an unsettling sound, as though the ride itself was eager to begin. My heart pounded in my chest as the faint sound of gears grinding to life filled the air. A faint mechanical whine echoed from deep within the ride structure, and I could feel the car shudder beneath me. There was no turning back now. I had crossed the threshold, and I was trapped. The roller coaster jolted to life, the screech of its old tracks reverberating through the air as it began its slow ascent. The world around me seemed to blur, the park fading into a shadowed landscape as the car climbed higher and higher. The rusted tracks creaked and groaned beneath the weight of the ride, as if they were barely holding on, as though they too were aware that this ride was not meant to continue. I glanced nervously over the edge of the car, my stomach dropping as the ground seemed to recede further and further below. The park, once vast and sprawling, now felt small, insignificant. At the peak, there was a moment of stillness. The wind seemed to hold its breath, and I could feel the cool air pressing against me from all sides. It was as though time itself had paused. And then, without warning, the car lurched forward, hurtling down the first steep drop. My body was thrown against the restraints as the ride picked up speed, the world spinning around me in a blur of motion and sound. The wind screamed past my ears, my heart racing as the car twisted and turned through the dilapidated structure. I wanted to scream, to beg for the ride to stop, but my voice was swallowed by the deafening roar of the tracks. The roller coaster twisted in impossible angles, bending and swaying as if defying the laws of physics. Each turn seemed to take me further into the unknown, as if the park itself were guiding me towards some unseen destination. The shadows around me seemed to stretch and warp, flickering in and out of view like fleeting memories. As we descended into the next loop, something changed. The air grew colder still, and the shadows in the corners of my vision seemed to stretch and reach toward me. I could feel eyes upon me, cold, unseen eyes watching from every corner of the park. The ride continued its path, but it no longer felt like a ride at all. It felt like a journey, one that would never end. The twists, the turns, the drops, they all blurred together into a nightmarish tapestry, an endless spiral that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, in the midst of it all, I heard it, a voice. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the roller coaster's screeching metal, but it was unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its voice dripping with cold malice. "The ride never ends." I froze, my mind racing to comprehend the meaning of the words. The park, the ride, had it all been a trap? Was I being guided into something I couldn't escape? My heart thudded in my chest as the car lurched through another dizzying loop. The shadows seemed to pulse around me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. It wasn't just a ride that would never end, it was me. I had come here seeking answers, but I was beginning to realize that the park wasn't simply a place. It was a prison, a maze of fear and memories, and I was trapped within its walls. The ride was not a means of escape. It was the beginning of something far worse. Something that would continue to torment me long after I had left this place behind. The roller coaster's relentless descent pulled me deeper into the shadows, the world around me distorting with every twist and turn. Each loop seemed to stretch further into the unknown, and I felt as if I was no longer on a ride, but rather being consumed by the very park itself. The track groaned under my weight, and the wind howled in my ears like a chorus of lost souls. I could barely keep my eyes open as the car whipped through another rapid turn, the cold air biting into my skin. The sense of dread that had once been a whisper was now an undeniable force, pressing against me like a physical weight. I couldn't escape the overwhelming sensation that something was wrong, fundamentally wrong. The park was alive, yes, but it was not the kind of life I had imagined. It was as though the park had become sentient, aware of my every move, of my every thought. The more I tried to resist the ride, the stronger the pull became. My mind raced as I struggled to make sense of what was happening. Why was I here? Why had I chosen this forsaken place? I had come to the park looking for answers, but now I feared the answers would be more than I could bear. The car slowed suddenly, jerking me forward against the restraints. For a brief moment, the world outside the ride stood still. The wind ceased, and the metal tracks groaned in silence. A thick fog had begun to roll across the ground, creeping in from the edges of the park, swallowing the path behind me. The silence that followed was oppressive, a vacuum that seemed to suck all the life from the air. In that moment, I realized I had entered a place where time did not follow its natural course. There was no rhythm, no flow, only a constant tugging at the edges of my consciousness, as if the park was trying to pull me into its very fabric. Then, the voice returned. It was louder this time, unmistakable. "You're not alone," it hissed, its voice cold and distant. It felt as though it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I looked around frantically, but the fog obscured my vision, and the track ahead appeared to stretch infinitely, vanishing into the darkness. The sensation of being watched returned with full force, and I could feel eyes, no, something glaring at me from the obscured corners of the park. I had never believed in the supernatural. I had never subscribed to ghost stories or legends of haunted places. But now, as I sat frozen in that car, the overwhelming force of whatever haunted this forsaken amusement park shattered every rational thought I had. The whispers, the inexplicable sensations, everything was beginning to merge into something far more tangible, far more terrifying than I had ever imagined. This wasn't just an abandoned park, it was a place of deep, sinister energy. The air itself was thick with it. I began to notice that the fog seemed to pulse. It wasn't just rolling over the ground, it was moving in rhythm like a heartbeat, and with each pulse the whispers grew louder. The words I could barely understand before were becoming clearer. They were repeating, echoing in my head like an ominous mantra. "Stay, don't leave, stay, don't leave." The repetition of the words sent a shiver down my spine. It was as if the park was trying to convince me to remain, to belong to it. The more the whispers reached me, the stronger the grip on my mind became. I felt my body tense, my hands gripping the sides of the car as if they could anchor me to reality. And yet, I was drifting. The edges of my vision seemed to blur, and I was no longer certain where the ride began and where it ended. Was I still on the roller coaster? Or had I somehow been transported to a different reality altogether? The tracks beneath me twisted in impossible ways, looping and spiraling in directions that defied all logic. It was as though I was descending into the bowels of some great, hidden beast, and I, a mere pawn, was caught in its unrelenting pull. With a sudden, jarring lurch, the car shot upward, faster than before, and I felt the blood rush to my head. I wanted to scream, but my voice was silenced by the deafening roar of the wind. The fog thickened, becoming almost tangible, as though it were alive, reaching, swirling, closing in on me. In the distance, I thought I saw something moving, something large, something enormous, a shadow that shifted between the beams of the ride's frame. My heart raced, and the fear that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long finally erupted. I was no longer just afraid of the ride. I was afraid of what was in the park with me. The whispers became insistent now, frantic. "You have to stay. You can't leave. You belong here." The words were so sharp, so desperate, that I could feel them digging into my mind, trying to carve a place in my thoughts. I shook my head violently, trying to clear the growing fog from my brain. But it was too late. The park had already begun its slow, steady invasion. The sensation of being consumed deepened as the car plummeted into another darkened loop, and my body was pressed violently into the seat. I had to escape. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let whatever was happening inside the park sink its claws into me. But as I fought against the overwhelming pressure, I realized something terrifying. There was no way out. The ride would never stop. The whispers, the fog, the unseen forces, they would follow me. They had already taken root, and no matter how much I struggled, no matter how much I tried to escape, I was already too far gone. As the car twisted and turned again, I could feel the parcel pushing against me, urging me to succumb to its grip. The track had no end. It was endless, looping, spiraling into eternity. And deep within the fog, something was waiting. Something old, something ancient. It had been here long before I arrived, and it would remain long after I left. The ride would never end. It was only just beginning. The ride finally came to an eerie halt, the car jerking to a stop as it reached a platform that seemed more like a stage for some twisted performance. I was disoriented, gasping for breath, trying to steady myself. The fog was still thick around me, hanging in the air like a veil, obscuring the once familiar sights of the amusement park. For a moment, I wondered if I was dreaming, if this entire nightmare was a fabrication of my mind, brought on by exhaustion or fear. But the aching in my chest, the tremor in my hands, these were real. And the strange hum that buzzed through the air was undeniable. This place was alive in ways that defied understanding. I sat frozen for a long while, staring into the thick, swirling mist. I had no idea how much time had passed, but I knew that I was no longer simply trapped in a ride. This was something far more sinister, far more inescapable. The fog began to shift around me, as if it were reacting to some unseen force, and I felt its weight pressing on my chest. The whispers, which had been sporadic, began to grow louder again. They seemed to surround me, their tones shifting from pleading to something darker, more demanding. "Come closer. Join us. You belong here." I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I had to escape, but there was nowhere to run. The park stretched out before me, endless in every direction, its once vibrant colors now dulled and decaying. The remnants of forgotten rides loomed like ghostly sentinels, watching my every move. The twisted metal of the Ferris wheel creaked in the distance, its silhouette barely visible through the fog. For a brief moment, I wondered if I had truly entered the park's haunted heart, or if the park itself had become a living entity, twisting the very fabric of reality to ensnare me. The more I thought about it, the more impossible it seemed to leave. It was as if the park had somehow constructed itself around me, creating an invisible barrier that I couldn't break through. I rose from the car seat, my legs shaky beneath me. Every step I took felt as if I were walking through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, a place where the rules of the world I knew no longer applied. I was inside something else now, something far darker and more elusive than any terror I had ever imagined. And then in the distance, I saw it, a light, faint at first, flickering in and out, but unmistakable. It was the only thing not shrouded in fog, the only thing that pierced through the thick, unnatural haze. The curiosity that had been dormant in me suddenly ignited. What was that light? Was it a sign of life? Or was it yet another trick of the park designed to lure me deeper into its grasp? Despite every instinct telling me to stay put, to wait, I found myself drawn toward it. The whispers were now insistent, their voices rising in a chorus of voices that seemed to overlap each other, growing louder and more powerful. They spoke to me directly, as though they could read my thoughts, sensing my doubt, my fear. "Come closer. You're meant to be here. You are part of this place now." I hesitated for a moment, standing at the edge of the car platform, my eyes locked on the flickering light. Then, something strange happened. The ground beneath me trembled, and a soft, grinding sound echoed through the fog. I looked down at my feet, noticing the tracks. No longer the roller coaster rails, but something else entirely, twisting and curling toward the light. It was as if the park itself was inviting me, pulling me forward, constructing the path I was meant to follow. The fog parted momentarily, revealing a strange, decrepit carousel in the distance. Its once bright colors faded and peeling, its horses frozen in mid-gallop. The moment I stepped onto the track, the whispers stopped. A deathly silence filled the air, pressing against my eardrums. For the first time since I had arrived, I felt a strange sense of peace. It was unnerving, the way the silence enveloped me. Too quiet, too still. The moment I looked up again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The light was not a simple beacon. It was a doorway, and standing just beyond it was something else, something that shouldn't have been there. At first, it appeared as nothing more than a shadow, an indistinct form lurking just out of my sight. But as I drew closer, the figure came into focus. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in ways no human body should. Its features were obscured by a dark hood, but its eyes glowed, a sickly, unnatural green that seemed to pierce the darkness around it. The figure stood still, watching me as if waiting for me to approach. And yet, I could feel a deep, unsettling pull toward it, as if something inside me was urging me to move forward. I stopped just short of the figure, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. It raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, and pointed toward me. "You have been chosen," the figure whispered, its voice a rasping echo that seemed to reverberate in the air. "Come closer. Your place is here, with us." The words hung in the air like a curse, and I felt the weight of them press against me, trapping me in place. For a brief moment, I wondered if this was the end, if I had truly been consumed by the park. But even as my body trembled with fear, something deeper inside me, something primal, fought against the pull. I was not ready to surrender. Not yet. But the figure did not move. It simply stood there, its glowing eyes fixed on me, waiting. It was not just an invitation. It was a command, a promise of something beyond the realm of what I had ever known. And as I stood frozen, I realized that no matter what I chose, there would be no turning back. I had no idea how long I stood there, staring into the glowing, unnatural eyes of the figure that loomed before me. Time seemed to lose its meaning in this place, as though the laws of reality had been distorted, stretched into something unfamiliar. The air was thick with a tension that I couldn't shake, a sensation of being on the verge of something crucial, something that would alter everything. But even as the figure beckoned me, something inside of me resisted. I had to make a choice. And in that moment, I understood that the decision was far more than whether to step forward or retreat. It was a decision about who I was, what I was becoming, and what I was willing to sacrifice. "Your place is here, with us." The figure's voice rasped again, more insistent this time. It wasn't just a suggestion, it felt like a command. The words reverberated through my mind, creating a nauseating pressure in my skull. The part of me that had been filled with terror, with the urge to flee, was now wrestling with something darker, something that whispered of power and belonging. It promised something more than escape from the haunted park. It offered a place, somewhere I would be accepted, understood, even revered. The figure did not move, its outstretched hand still pointing at me, as if it had frozen time itself, holding me in place. I looked around, but the fog had thickened again, swallowing the park's decaying landmarks, casting the place into an eerie, endless void. In that void, the figure seemed to loom larger, as though it were drawing me in, its form both distant and imminent, stretching and warping the space around it. I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, a feeling that my mind was being pulled apart, divided between fear and something darker, something that whispered my name. What was I becoming? It was a question I had never asked myself before. I had come here to escape, to outrun my past, my regrets, my broken self. But this place, this cursed park, seemed to offer something far more intoxicating, an escape into something new, a new identity, a new purpose. Was I strong enough to resist? Was I weak enough to accept? The figure's eyes gleamed in the dim light, the green hue pulsating with an otherworldly rhythm. I felt the pressure mounting, felt the weight of its gaze burrowing into me, carving its way deep inside, scraping away the layers of resistance. The park had already begun to twist me, reshape me. Was it so different from my life outside the gates? Wasn't I always searching for something to belong to, somewhere to fit in? The thought made my stomach churn, but I couldn't deny the appeal of what lay before me. Suddenly, the fog around me swirled again, and something shifted. The carousel in the distance, the one I had noticed earlier, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was no longer a decaying relic, but a glowing, vibrant symbol of the park's strange power. A flicker of movement caught my eye, and I saw something that sent a shiver through my body. A figure on one of the carousel horses, slowly turning, its face hidden in shadow. The rider's position seemed to mock me, as if waiting for me to choose. It was a cruel game, a twisted form of encouragement. I felt as though I were standing on the edge of a precipice, looking into a vast, unknown abyss, with nothing but the figure's outstretched hand to guide me. "Don't you want to know what awaits beyond this veil?" the figure's voice asked, its tone now a seductive whisper, like a promise too tempting to resist. "What lies in the heart of the park? What is hidden behind the doors you have yet to open?" The questions reverberated in my mind, amplifying my inner turmoil. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn back, to run, to find another way out of this madness. But every word from the figure made it harder to deny the dark allure of its promise. The park had already begun to crawl beneath my skin, reshaping my thoughts, twisting my fears into something more primal. I realized then that the choice wasn't just about the park. It was about power. The power to control my fate, to escape the endless cycle of regrets and failures that had defined my life up until this point. But at what cost? Could I truly abandon everything I had known, just to claim a place here with the figure in the fog? Could I forfeit my humanity for something I couldn't yet understand? My gaze flickered back to the carousel, to the haunting figure upon it. The shadowed rider, unmoving, seemed to beckon me. I felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me, suffocating my breath, squeezing my chest in an unrelenting grip. My mind raced, each second stretching into eternity. There was no going back from this moment. If I chose to step forward, to accept the figure's invitation, I would cross a threshold I might never return from. And yet, despite the swirling chaos in my mind, one thought began to stand out above all others. What would I become if I refused? The thought frightened me even more than the park itself, more than the figure that waited with its glowing eyes. The terror of losing myself, of being stuck outside this place, out in the world that had rejected me, was greater than the fear of the unknown. I took a step forward. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, I felt a rush of cold air that seemed to suck the breath from my lungs. The fog swirled around me, engulfing my body as the eerie glow of the figure's eyes faded into the distance. I stood still for a moment, unsure of what to expect, but the park had already begun to shift around me. The once distant sounds, the creaks and groans of decaying rides, the whispers in the air, grew louder, more pronounced. It was as if the very park was coming alive, its broken bones groaning in response to my decision. For a moment, I thought I might still have control over my actions. I could turn around, run, and try to escape the pull of whatever force had lured me into this nightmare. But the deeper I stepped into the park, the more impossible that seemed. The fog thickened, wrapping itself around me, and I realized that the path I had chosen was irreversible. The world I had known, the world I thought I was escaping, had begun to fall away, like sand slipping through my fingers. The carousel, now closer than ever, was no longer an innocent relic. It had transformed into something far more grotesque. The horses had become twisted, their faces contorted into expressions of anguish. Their eyes were hollow, like the empty sockets of a skull, and their once elegant, proud forms were now broken and deformed, their limbs hanging at odd angles. And yet, despite the grotesque nature of the scene, they still seemed to move. Slowly, their bodies rocked back and forth, as if they were breathing. I had crossed into a realm where the laws of reality no longer applied, and every step I took felt like a step into madness. The very air seemed to pulse with energy, and with each breath, I felt myself drawn further into the heart of the park. The further I walked, the more the surroundings morphed into something unfamiliar, something alien. The edges of reality had begun to fray, and the deeper I went, the more I felt the tug of whatever force ruled this place. The path before me grew narrower, the fog closing in around me like a trap. The trees that lined the route, once full of life, now stood like twisted, gnarled versions of themselves. Their branches stretched out at unnatural angles, reaching for me as though they were trying to pull me closer, to drag me into their grasp. The park, which had once been a place of joy and laughter, had transformed into something nightmarish. The remnants of the rides and attractions, once designed to provide amusement, now seemed like dark monuments to forgotten souls. As I continued to walk, the ground beneath my feet began to tremble. At first, it was subtle, a slight vibration that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. But soon, the shaking grew more pronounced. The trees around me swayed, and I could hear the distant, mournful sound of metal groaning under pressure. The park was waking up, and I had no idea whether that was a good thing or a terrible one. Suddenly, I heard a voice, soft at first, like a whisper in the wind, but growing louder with each passing second. It was a voice I had heard before, though I couldn't quite place it. It was familiar, yet distant, like an echo from a time long past. "You shouldn't have come," the voice said, and there was a strange sadness in it. "You should have stayed away." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I turned in every direction, trying to locate the source of the voice. But there was no one around. The park remained silent, save for the unsettling hum that now filled the air. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of the voice. Who was it? Was it one of the lost souls the park had claimed? Or was it someone else? The thought gnawed at me, eating away at my composure. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, I finally reached the center of the park. Here, the fog was thicker than ever, swirling around in frantic patterns as if caught in some kind of storm. At the center of this swirling mass of mist stood a large, ornate gate, its iron bars twisted and curled into grotesque shapes, like serpents coiling around one another. There was no sign of a path beyond the gate, only darkness. A cold, suffocating darkness that seemed to breathe in time with the park itself. It was the gate I had been drawn to, the gate that had promised something beyond the veil. I knew that behind it lay the heart of the park, the place where the rules of reality had no meaning, where the darkness of the park's twisted soul was most concentrated. And yet, despite everything, I felt an undeniable urge to approach. There was something in the air, something that urged me forward, whispering promises of answers, of power, of freedom. But just as I reached out to touch the gate, a sudden rush of wind blew through the park, sending a chill down my spine. The gate creaked, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move within the darkness beyond it. It was brief, like the flash of a shadow passing through the gate. My heart raced in my chest, and I pulled my hand back, a wave of unease washing over me. The park was alive, and it was watching. I stood frozen before the gate, my fingers tingling from the brief touch, as though the very air around me had turned electric. The wind that had swept through moments earlier died down as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a silence so profound it was suffocating. The kind of silence that didn't merely fall over a place. It seemed to seep into your bones, into your thoughts. The dark abyss beyond the gate seemed to pulse with an unseen force, as though something were waiting, watching, expecting me to make the next move. But now that I had come this far, I found myself questioning the path I was on. The curiosity that had once driven me forward now mixed with an overwhelming sense of dread. The park had shifted from a place of eerie fascination to a suffocating nightmare. The gate before me, though twisted and decayed, seemed strangely inviting, a doorway to an unknown realm that promised more than mere answers. In the distance, the carousel continued its slow, haunting movement, its hollow-eyed horses spinning endlessly on their broken tracks. The sounds of their motion, once unnerving, now seemed oddly comforting, like a lullaby played by a twisted hand. I realized then that the park wasn't just a place. It was alive in a way that no place should be. It had a mind, a will, and I had become a part of it, whether I liked it or not. I stepped forward again, my feet almost instinctively carrying me toward the gate. The closer I got, the more oppressive the air became, thick with the scent of damp wood and rusted metal. As my hand hovered over the twisted bars, I felt a sudden, sharp coldness, a biting chill that seemed to come from within the gate itself. It was as if the darkness on the other side was reaching out, calling me, tempting me to enter. The thought of what lay beyond filled my mind with both wonder and terror. What would I find in that suffocating darkness? Was it the truth I had been seeking, or was it something far worse? Before I could gather the courage to push the gate open, a voice broke the silence. This time, it wasn't distant or muffled. It was right beside me, a soft, almost soothing whisper that curled around my ear like a serpent. "You don't need to go further," the voice said. "The answers you seek are not beyond this gate. They are within you. You only need to see them." I turned quickly, my heart racing, but there was no one there. The fog, thick as ever, swirled around me, masking the world in an impenetrable haze. The voice had come from nowhere and everywhere, a presence that seemed to live in the very air itself. It wasn't human. It was the park itself, its consciousness speaking directly to me, attempting to sway me from my course. But I couldn't stop now. I had come too far, crossed too many lines to turn back. I had already given in to the park's call. It was too late for doubt. I needed to know what lay beyond, to uncover the truth hidden within this cursed place. I placed my hands on the gate and pushed. The iron bars creaked under my weight, resisting for a moment before giving way with a terrible screech. The darkness beyond the gate seemed to welcome me, drawing me in with an invisible pull. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped forward, crossing the threshold. The moment I entered, the air seemed to shift again. The world around me stretched and distorted, the ground beneath my feet becoming uneven, like walking on the surface of some strange, shifting landscape. The darkness deepened, and I could no longer see the faint glow of the park's far-off lights. I was swallowed by the void, enveloped by the oppressive, suffocating silence. It felt as if I were walking into the very heart of the park, where its twisted soul resided. I stumbled forward, my hands reaching out for anything solid, but there was nothing. The world around me seemed to disappear, leaving me floating in a boundless emptiness. Then, without warning, a light flickered in the distance. Faint at first, but growing brighter with each step I took toward it. It wasn't a natural light, but a strange, unnatural glow, pulsating like a heartbeat. The light led me to what I can only describe as a vast chamber, a cavernous space that seemed to defy all logic. The walls were lined with broken mirrors, their surfaces cracked and jagged. The reflections that stared back at me were not my own, but twisted, distorted versions of myself. Figures with hollow eyes, with gaping mouths that screamed silently, as though they were trapped within the glass. I wanted to look away, to flee from the horrific images staring back at me, but I couldn't. Something in me, something primal and dark, was drawn to them. These reflections weren't just showing me distorted versions of myself. They were showing me what I could become, what the park had promised me. They whispered to me in voices that sounded like my own, but wrong, so wrong. "This is what you've come for," they said. "This is what you were always meant to be." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The park wasn't just a place. It was a mirror, reflecting back the darkest parts of me, the parts one had tried to bury, the parts that longed for power, for belonging. The park had offered me more than just answers. It had offered me a chance to become something more, something beyond what I had ever imagined. But the cost was clear. My humanity. I could become something else entirely, but at what price? I turned away from the mirrors, my mind reeling. The park wasn't trying to help me. It was trying to consume me, to pull me deeper into its dark embrace. And I was already too far gone to escape. In the moments after the revelation, a heavy silence settled around me. The mirrored figures had stopped whispering, but their twisted reflections remained, haunting the walls of the cavernous room. I could still feel their eyes on me, the weight of their presence pressing in from every angle. It was as though the park itself had recognized my fear, my hesitation, and was savoring it. The space seemed to breathe with me, each intake of my breath matching the slow, rhythmic pulse of the light that continued to glow in the distance. I should have left. I knew that. Every instinct told me to turn around, to run back through the gate, to escape the suffocating grip of this place before it consumed me entirely. But something else kept me rooted to the spot, something I couldn't explain. Was it the promise of power, of knowing the truth? Or was it something darker, something primal that wanted to surrender to the park's will? As if on cue, the faint light in the distance flickered again, drawing me forward. My feet moved without my consent, as though they were being pulled by an invisible force. I tried to resist, to stop myself, but my legs betrayed me, carrying me further into the depths of the room. With every step, the air grew colder, denser, as though the space itself were compressing. The light beckoned, and with each step, the shadows grew longer, more distorted. I reached the source of the light, a stone pedestal slick with a thin layer of mist. Atop it, bathed in an eerie, otherworldly glow, sat a single object, a small, ornate box. It was beautiful in an unsettling way, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to move and shift when I looked at them too long. The box appeared to hum, vibrating slightly in the still air, as though it were alive, waiting for me. I reached out, my fingers trembling. As soon as I touched the box, a surge of energy coursed through my body, and I recoiled, almost dropping it. The sensation was overwhelming, a rush of cold, followed by an intense warmth that seemed to seep into my skin, into my bones. It was as though the box was infusing me with its essence, offering me something, but at what cost? The park's presence was overwhelming now. It felt as if the very walls of the room were closing in on me, and I could hear a low, guttural hum that seemed to emanate from the box itself. It was calling to me, urging me to open it. The whispers that had haunted the mirrors now returned, louder, more insistent. Open it, they coaxed. It's yours. Everything you've ever wanted, everything you've been seeking is inside. For a moment, I hesitated. The fear gnawed at me, a visceral, primal dread that I couldn't shake. What would happen if I opened the box? Would it reveal the truth, the answers I had been searching for? Or would it unleash something far worse, something I wasn't prepared for? The park had already shown me its power, its ability to twist reality and break the boundaries of the world. Could I truly trust it now? But as I stood there, the box in my hands, I realized that I had already made my choice. The park had drawn me in, and I had allowed myself to be lured by its promises. I had crossed the threshold, and now there was no going back. The answers I sought were not outside this place. They were buried within it, hidden behind the veil of its twisted illusions. And if I wanted to understand it, to understand myself, I would have to take the final step. With a deep breath, I opened the box. The instant the lid lifted, a wave of energy crashed over me. It was as though I had opened a door to another world, a world that existed outside of time, outside of the very fabric of reality. The light that had surrounded the box flared brightly, blinding me for a moment. And in that moment, I saw it. Inside the box was not an object, but a swirling vortex of light and shadow, an ever-shifting maelstrom that seemed to pulse with life. It was beautiful, terrifying, and infinite. The darkness within it beckoned, promising answers, promising power, promising everything I had ever wanted. But there was a catch. I could feel it. The darkness wanted something in return, something I was not yet willing to give. The park had offered me a bargain. It had given me a choice. Embrace the darkness, become part of its endless cycle, or reject it and face the consequences. I had no idea what would happen if I rejected it, but I knew that doing so would mean leaving behind everything I had gained, everything the park had promised me. To embrace it, however, would mean surrendering myself to the very thing that had drawn me here. The darkness that pulsed at the heart of the park, the same darkness that had begun to reshape me, twist me into something else. As I stared into the swirling maelstrom, I could hear the voices again, louder now, speaking not just to me, but through me. Make your choice, they whispered, their tones full of anticipation. It's your destiny. Embrace it. Let it consume you. Let it make you whole. I stood at the crossroads, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Could I truly accept what the park was offering? Could I let go of everything I once was in exchange for something more? Or would I walk away, forever trapped in the uncertainty of the unknown? The offering lay before me, and the choice was mine. The vortex inside the box continued to swirl before me, its colors flickering in a hypnotic dance. I felt my pulse quicken as I stood on the precipice, the weight of the choice pressing down on my chest. The voices, those unearthly whispers, had grown deafening now, reverberating in my mind with a force that felt like it was tearing me apart. Every part of me screamed to turn away, to close the box and walk out of the park forever. Yet there was something else, something in the depths of my soul, that urged me to stay, to delve deeper into whatever this was. I had come so far. Could I really walk away now? For a moment, I felt suspended in time, caught between the pull of the darkness and the fear that rooted me to the present. The park had already shown me its power, its ability to manipulate the very fabric of my reality. It had twisted the familiar into the grotesque, reshaped the past, and turned my memories into a labyrinth of illusions. Yet here I was still standing, still uncertain of what I had become, of what I was about to become. The voices began to chant now, an eerie chorus, each word pressing into my mind like a nail being driven into wood. "It is your destiny," they intoned. "Accept the offering. Become one with the darkness. You are not like the others. You are meant for more." Their words sent a shiver down my spine. I had been told that I was different, that I had a purpose that no one else could understand. But did that purpose lie here, in the heart of the park, in this twisted realm of shadow and light? Or was this the very thing I had been trying to escape all along? A force that would strip me of my humanity, replacing it with something far darker, something unknown? The energy within the box pulsed, as if waiting for me to make my move. It was an ancient primal power, older than the park itself, and it had chosen me. I could feel it, the connection between us, as though the park and I were intertwined, bound by some invisible thread that neither of us could sever. I took a deep breath, summoning the last remnants of my strength. With a trembling hand, I closed the lid of the box. The voices ceased in an instant, replaced by a deafening silence that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if I had made the right choice, if I had avoided the trap the park had set for me. But then, as the quiet settled around me, a deep rumble resonated through the ground beneath my feet. The park was shifting again, reacting to my decision. It began slowly at first, just a subtle tremor that rattled the walls. But then, the shaking grew more intense. The floor beneath me cracked, and the walls seemed to stretch and warp, their edges curling like paper caught in a flame. The room itself seemed to be alive, breathing in and out, as though it were preparing for something. The park had known what I would choose. It had anticipated this. I was no longer an outsider, no longer a mere visitor. The park had claimed me as its own. The air grew colder, the chill biting into my skin, and the light that had once illuminated the room flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The once distant hum that had accompanied the box now thrummed in the air around me, vibrating in my chest. The shadows seemed to grow longer, reaching out toward me, their forms twisting and writhing like serpents. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as though the very space itself was shrinking. The park had consumed the room, and now it was coming for me. Panic surged through me as I backed away, my heart racing. What had I unleashed by closing the box? The darkness that had once seemed so alluring now felt suffocating, oppressive, as though it was closing in on me from every side. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, their words now unintelligible, but filled with an undeniable sense of hunger. The room spun, and I stumbled, losing my footing as the floor seemed to twist beneath me. The shadows converged on me, their forms taking on more solid shapes. Figures, faces, eyes that seemed to stare into my very soul. I could feel their gaze, the weight of their judgment pressing down on me, as though they were waiting for me to break, to give in to the fear, to succumb to the park's will. But then, amidst the chaos, a new presence emerged. It was subtle at first, a faint whisper, but it quickly grew stronger. It was a voice, not of the park, but something else, something far more ancient, far more powerful. It called to me by name. "You have made the right choice," the voice said, its tone deep and resonant, filled with an unsettling calm. "You are not meant to be a puppet, a mere plaything of the park's twisted desires. You are here for a different purpose, a purpose that will transcend even this place." The voice seemed to fill the space, echoing off the warped walls. It was a voice I didn't recognize, but somehow I knew it was speaking the truth. The park had been manipulating me, twisting my perceptions, feeding me lies. It had been using me as a pawn in its grand design. But the voice, it was offering me something else, something more. I couldn't explain it, couldn't fully comprehend what was happening. But I knew, in that moment, that my decision was far from over. The park had claimed me, yes, but I was not its prisoner. Not yet. Something had shifted within me, and I had to learn how to control it, to wield the power that the park had tried to give me. I had made my choice, but it was only the beginning. As the room settled back into stillness, the shadows retreated, and the whispers quieted once more. The box was now closed, but the power it contained still lingered, resonating in the air around me. I wasn't sure what came next, but one thing was certain: the reckoning had only just begun. The days following my encounter with the box felt like a blur, each moment disjointed and fragile, as though I were drifting between two worlds. The park had changed. No longer did it feel like a forsaken, forgotten place. There was a pulse to it now, a dark rhythm beneath the surface that seemed to beat in time with my own. I could feel it in my bones, this new connection to the park, this growing awareness that my fate was no longer mine to control. I had chosen to close the box, but I hadn't understood what that decision would truly mean. The park, it seemed, had its own plans for me, plans that I couldn't yet comprehend. The once quiet corners of the amusement park were now alive with a strange energy. The empty rides, which had once stood as nothing more than rusted remnants of a forgotten time, began to hum with life. The Ferris wheel that had been stationary for as long as I could remember now creaked and groaned, as though it were about to begin its ascent into the night sky once more. The wooden roller coaster, long abandoned and overgrown with vines, trembled as though it were preparing for another descent. Yet, these movements were not natural. They were slow, deliberate, as if each ride were testing the boundaries of its new existence. I could hear it in the distance, the faint sound of music, a carnival tune played in a minor key. It was unsettling, far from the joyous melodies of a vibrant theme park. This music felt hollow, as though it had been distorted by time itself, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was calling to me, urging me to come closer. I tried to ignore it, but it was as if the sound was weaving its way into the very fabric of my thoughts, growing louder with each passing hour. Every path I took seemed to lead me closer to the heart of the park, to the very source of this eerie music. I had made the decision to close the box, to seal away whatever power it contained. Yet, despite my choice, the park seemed more alive than ever. It had not receded into the shadows as I had hoped. Instead, it had flourished, feeding off the very energy I had released. The buildings, once dark and crumbling, now exuded a faint glow, as though the park itself were awakening from a long, slumbering dream. As I walked through the park, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The eyes, those haunting faces I had seen before, seemed to be everywhere. Not just in the shadows, but in the light too. Reflections in broken windows, glimmers in the distorted glass of the funhouse mirrors. Everywhere I turned, I was confronted by them. They were not the faces of any living being, but rather something else, something ancient, far older than the park itself. The same eyes that had first haunted me in the darkness now followed me in broad daylight. The more I walked, the stronger the pull became. It was as if I had crossed some invisible threshold, a boundary between the world I knew and the twisted realm of the park. The deeper I ventured, the more distorted the landscape grew. The familiar paths twisted into impossible shapes, trees bent in unnatural angles, and the sky above darkened, despite the fact that the sun was still high. The line between reality and nightmare was growing thinner, and I was caught in the middle. And then I found it, the central hub of the park, a place I had never noticed before, though I was certain I had walked this path countless times. It was a pavilion, hidden away behind a veil of overgrown ivy, its walls cracked and weathered. Yet, as I approached, the doors opened on their own, as if beckoning me inside. The music, now louder and more insistent, seemed to be coming from within. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The room was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows, the walls lined with mirrors that reflected not my image, but something far darker. They were twisted, warped, showing faces that weren't my own, faces of people I had never seen, yet felt an inexplicable connection to. Their eyes, their expressions, were filled with despair, with longing, as if they were trapped within the glass, begging for release. The music grew louder still, and I felt my heart race as the air grew thick with a palpable tension. It was as though the room was alive, its every corner alive with energy, and I was at the center of it. I wanted to run, to escape, but my feet refused to move. The walls seemed to close in on me, the mirrors shifting and warping with each breath I took. In the center of the room, there was a pedestal. Atop it sat a small, ornate box, identical to the one I had closed all those days ago. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was. The box had returned, but this wasn't the same box. It was more than that. It was the manifestation of the park's power, a symbol of its claim over me. The air around me grew cold, the music now drowning out everything else, leaving only the rhythmic beating of my own pulse in my ears. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed the surface of the box. The second my skin made contact, the ground beneath me seemed to shift once more. The walls of the pavilion buckled inward, and the mirrors, those twisted reflections, began to crack, splintering into millions of shards. And then everything stopped. The music ceased. The ground held still. The mirrors, broken and jagged, now lay in pieces on the floor, their fractured reflections no longer haunting me. For a moment, the entire world felt suspended in time, as though the park itself had held its breath. But I knew, deep down, that the stillness was not peace. It was anticipation. The park had set its stage, and I had walked into its final act. There was no turning back now. Whatever lay ahead was beyond my understanding. The quiet that followed my interaction with the box was almost deafening, a stillness that clung to the air like a thick fog. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if I had imagined it all. The strange music, the warped reflections, the eerie call of the park that seemed to pull me in. But as I stood there, the broken mirrors scattered around me like shards of shattered dreams, I realized that this was no hallucination. This was real, and the park was more than just a place. It was alive, breathing, and waiting. I took a hesitant step back from the pedestal, my eyes locked on the remnants of the box. Despite its small size, it now seemed impossibly heavy, its presence filling the room like an oppressive force. I had thought that by closing it, I could lock away whatever darkness had been unleashed, but now, in the aftermath, it felt as though the park itself was unraveling, its tendrils reaching out into the world beyond. The music that had once filled the air was now silent, but the emptiness it left behind was palpable, vibrating through the ground, the walls, and even my very bones. As I turned to leave the pavilion, I realized that I had no idea where I was going. The park had changed again, its layout now unfamiliar and disorienting. The paths I once knew had shifted, transformed into labyrinths of twisted, gnarled trees and broken rides that seemed to loom closer with every step. The distant sounds of creaking metal and the occasional whisper of the wind no longer comforted me. Instead, they felt like harbingers of something far worse, a reminder that I had no control here. It was then that I heard it again, the sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, but unmistakably close. My heart skipped a beat, my pulse quickening as I spun around, expecting to see some other wanderer. Perhaps another lost soul trapped in this place. But there was no one there. The air was empty, still, and yet the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. It was as if the very earth itself was alive, breathing in sync with me, its heartbeat resonating deep within the ground. I forced myself to move forward, though every part of me screamed to turn back, to flee from this place. The park had always been unnerving, but now it felt like a prison, a living, breathing entity that I was a part of whether I wanted to be or not. As I stumbled through the twisted paths, I noticed something new. The once dead trees that lined the way were now covered in strange markings, symbols carved deep into their bark, their edges sharp and jagged, as though they had been etched with a sense of urgency, a desperation. Some of the symbols resembled faces, others were incomprehensible patterns, but all of them seemed to be watching me, judging me. I stumbled into an area of the park I had never seen before, an old carousel, its horses frozen in mid-gallop, their eyes wide and hollow. The carousel had long since stopped spinning, but now, as I stood before it, I could hear the faint sound of its music playing once more, a haunting lullaby that seemed to pull at the edges of my sanity. It was soft at first, a whisper on the wind, but as I approached, it grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the carousel itself was calling to me. There was no escaping it. My body moved of its own accord, my feet carrying me toward the rusted gate that separated me from the carousel. As I reached out to touch the iron bars, a shock of cold coursed through my fingers, making me flinch. The metal was impossibly cold, colder than the night air, colder than the deadest winter. And yet, the carousel itself seemed to glow with a faint, eerie light, its once broken lights flickering to life, casting grotesque shadows against the walls. I could feel the pull of the music, the tug of the ride, as though it were a part of me, its rhythm syncing with the pulse in my chest. The horses on the carousel now seemed to move, their eyes following me, their painted lips stretching into grotesque smiles. I wanted to scream, to run away, but my legs were frozen, my feet rooted to the ground as the carousel began to spin once more. I couldn't look away. The horses, now alive in a way I couldn't explain, beckoned to me. Their eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, their teeth bared in grotesque grins. They were not the beautiful creatures they once were, but nightmarish, monstrous things that had taken on a life of their own. I had no choice but to step forward, my hand gripping the cold metal of the gate as I pulled it open. The carousel's music intensified, louder and louder, until it felt as though the sound itself would tear me apart. The horses began to circle, their eyes following my every movement, their bodies swaying as they turned in their endless, dizzying circles. And then, from within the center of the carousel, I heard a voice, a soft, mocking whisper that sent chills down my spine. "You should have left when you had the chance." I froze, my breath caught in my throat as the world around me seemed to tilt, the ground beneath my feet shifting, warping. I tried to turn, to flee, but the world spun faster and faster, the carousel's rhythm matching the beat of my frantic pulse. The voice echoed again, this time clearer, sharper. "It's too late now." The darkness closed in. The carousel's music, the distorted, haunting tune, was the only thing I could hear as the world around me disappeared, leaving me in the cold grip of the park. I had crossed a threshold, one that could never be undone. The park was awake, and I was a part of it, trapped in its never-ending cycle. I awoke with a start, my body cold and stiff, my mind clouded by a strange fog. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The air around me felt dense, thick with an unnatural stillness. As I pushed myself to my feet, my hands brushed against the rough, decaying walls of what seemed like an old building, its structure long forgotten by the world outside. The familiar scent of damp earth and rusted metal filled my nostrils. I was no longer in the carousel's grip, but the park had drawn me deeper into its heart, where the air was heavier, more oppressive. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat, swallowed by the suffocating silence. I turned in a circle, hoping for some clue, some answer, but the darkness pressed in from every direction. It was as if the park itself had folded me into its depths, a place where time and space had lost all meaning. The world outside, the one I had known, felt like a distant memory, a fading echo that was slipping further and further away with each passing second. The building around me, if it could even be called that, seemed to be a part of the park, though I couldn't place its purpose. The walls were lined with broken windows, their panes cracked and missing, exposing only shadows. I could hear the faint whisper of wind, but there was no breeze, no source for the sound. And then I noticed the floor, if you could call it a floor. It was covered in layers of debris, old ticket stubs, forgotten trinkets, and remnants of things that once had meaning, but now had been reduced to refuse. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a smell so pungent it made me gag. I moved cautiously, my feet dragging through the clutter as I made my way deeper into the building. Every step felt like a violation, an intrusion into a place where no one was meant to tread. The walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching and shifting with each flicker of my flashlight. It was as though the very space was alive, watching me, waiting for something. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone, that there were eyes in the dark, tracking my every movement. As I ventured further into the building, I stumbled upon something strange, an old, rusted door, half hidden behind a pile of crumbling paper and what looked like a broken carnival ride prop. It was different from the rest of the walls, more solid, as if it had been placed there with purpose. I hesitated before reaching for the handle, my fingers trembling. It was as if the door itself was calling me, urging me to open it. And so, against every instinct telling me to leave, I did. The door creaked open with an unsettling groan, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into pitch darkness. I could hear the faint, distant sound of water dripping, echoing off the walls below. I stood at the top of the staircase for a long moment, trying to convince myself that I should turn back, that I had already gone too far. But something, the same thing that had drawn me into the park in the first place, pushed me forward. Curiosity, or maybe it was something darker, something the park had infected me with, that gnawing urge to know what lay beyond. I descended the stairs slowly, my flashlight casting long, trembling shadows across the stone steps. The air grew colder the deeper I went, the chill seeping into my bones, making my teeth chatter. The walls seemed to press in tighter, their rough surface scraping against my hands as I reached out to steady myself. The smell of wet stone and mold filled the air, stifling my breath, suffocating me. I felt like I was entering the very bowels of the park, as though each step was taking me closer to some unknown and terrifying truth. When I finally reached the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a large, cavernous room, its size impossible to fathom in the oppressive darkness. The air here was stagnant, heavy with the scent of something ancient. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move in the far corner. A figure, cloaked in shadows, standing still as a statue. My heart skipped a beat, my breath caught in my throat. I tried to call out, but no sound escaped my lips. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by an overwhelming sense of dread. The figure remained motionless, unblinking, and yet I felt its gaze upon me, felt it creeping under my skin. I was trapped, caught between the need to run and the compulsion to move closer. Something about it felt familiar, as though I had seen it before. The memories were there, just out of reach, like wisps of smoke that evaporated before I could grasp them. I knew that if I got too close, I would uncover something I was not ready to face. But the figure, whatever it was, refused to let me go. It stood there, still as ever, silently beckoning me forward. And then, in a split second, the figure was gone. I blinked, and it had vanished, dissolved into the darkness as though it had never been there. I was left standing in the cold, empty room, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been real? Had it been another hallucination brought on by the park's twisted power? Or was it something worse, something that had always been there, hidden in the corners of my mind, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? I stood there, unable to move, trying to gather my thoughts. The park had always felt like a place of horrors, but now, as I stood in this darkened chamber, I realized that I was not simply a visitor. I was part of it. The park was alive, and I had become a part of its twisted design. Whatever had happened here, whatever had been done to me, there was no escape. The more I tried to fight it, the more I felt myself being drawn deeper into its grasp, closer to whatever dark truth lay at its core. And then the whisper returned, soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing second. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice was not human, not in any sense I could understand. It was like 1,000 voices, all speaking in unison, their words an amalgamation of despair, anger, and something far worse. I tried to run, but the room seemed to stretch before me, the walls closing in, the air becoming thick and suffocating. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. It was as though the very park was alive, pulling me deeper, dragging me toward an inevitable end. There was no escape. The park had me now, and I was nothing more than a part of its twisted nightmare. The silence that followed the voice's cryptic warning was suffocating, a weight pressing down on my chest. My heart raced as I stood motionless in the dark, unsure of what to do next. The room around me felt both too vast and too small, as if the walls themselves were closing in and the space was endlessly expanding at the same time. I could still feel the eerie presence that had stalked me in the shadows, lingering like a memory that refuses to fade. I was beginning to lose track of time, of my sense of place, of everything that had once been clear. The whispering voice had disappeared, but its words hung in the air, sharp and lingering like a bitter aftertaste. "You're not supposed to be here." Those words were not simply a warning. They were a statement of fact, a harsh, undeniable truth that I could no longer ignore. It was as if the park had recognized my presence, acknowledged that I didn't belong, and that it would do everything in its power to make sure I felt the consequences. I turned to face the rest of the cavernous room, trying to push the sense of dread aside. The darkness seemed endless, stretching into infinity. There was something deeply wrong about this place, something ancient and powerful, its grip unrelenting. It was not just a disused amusement park. It was something far more sinister, something that thrived on fear, on isolation. I could feel it in every inch of the air I breathed, every step I took. This place was not just forgotten, it was forsaken, and it had its own rules. I slowly began to move, my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness, a constant reminder that I was not alone. Yet, despite the eerie quiet, there was an undercurrent of something else, something far less obvious. A murmur, like distant voices, that seemed to drift from somewhere deep within the very walls themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, mournful, desperate, as if those who had come before me were trapped in this nightmare, eternally searching for a way out. Every corner I turned seemed to lead me deeper into the park's labyrinth. The further I ventured, the more I realized that this building, this place, had once been something else entirely, something vibrant, alive. Old, crumbling signs hung from the walls, their once bright colors faded to almost nothing. The remnants of forgotten carnival games lay scattered in corners. A broken-down roller coaster track jutted out from a wall, its rusted metal curling like the skeleton of some long-dead creature. And then I found something that stopped me dead in my tracks, a faded photograph pinned to the wall. It was a group picture, old, grainy, and yellowed with age. The people in it were dressed in vintage clothing, smiling as they stood in front of a ride I didn't recognize. But there was something unnerving about their faces, something wrong about their smiles. It wasn't the joy of a moment captured in time. It was the eerie stillness of people who knew something dark, something they could never escape. Their eyes, vacant yet knowing, stared directly at me, as if they had been waiting for me all this time. I hesitated before touching the photo. My fingers trembled as they brushed against the yellowing edges, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming compulsion to rip it from the wall, to destroy it. The faces in the photograph were watching me, their eyes pleading. But something held me back. I could almost hear their voices in my mind, whispering the same thing over and over. Don't look back. But it was too late. As I turned away from the photograph, a loud creaking noise echoed behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding in my chest, expecting to find something or someone there. The photograph was still hanging on the wall, unchanged. But something had shifted. The room had grown colder, and the air felt heavier. A strange feeling of dread settled in the pit of my stomach, as if the very act of acknowledging that photo had triggered something I wasn't ready to face. And then, the lights flickered. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I saw the figures from the photograph standing at the far end of the room. Their eyes locked onto me with that same haunting intensity. But when the lights blinked back on, they were gone. I blinked, trying to clear the image from my mind. It couldn't have been real. It had to have been some trick of the light or my overactive imagination, driven by the fear that had been gnawing at me since I first set foot in this cursed place. I began to move again, my steps faster now, urgency building within me. I couldn't let my mind wander. I had to find a way out of this place before it consumed me entirely. But even as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight, but always there. The shadows seemed to stretch and contort unnaturally, bending in ways that defied logic. They were not just part of the darkness. They were alive, waiting for the perfect moment to reach out and claim me. I found myself standing before another door, this one different from the others. It was old, wooden, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm. A low hum seemed to emanate from the cracks in the doorframe. There was no handle, no way to open it, yet I felt an undeniable pull, a sense of inevitability. The door was beckoning me, just as the park had drawn me in, just as the figures in the photograph had called me forward. I knew, in that moment, that this was the only way forward. And so, with a steadying breath, I reached out and touched the door. The moment my fingers made contact, the air around me seemed to crackle with static. The temperature dropped even further, and the floor beneath me began to shift, as if the very foundation of the building was awakening. The whispers grew louder, louder than they had ever been, surrounding me from all sides. The door creaked, as though it were alive, groaning with a sound that reverberated through my bones. And then, slowly, the door began to open. The door creaked open with a sound that reverberated through the hollow space around me, as though the building itself were waking from a deep slumber. I hesitated before stepping over the threshold, my pulse quickening as the air around me grew colder still. It wasn't just the temperature that shifted. The very atmosphere felt denser, more oppressive, as though the space beyond the door was a pocket of something ancient and forgotten. The whispers, which had been faint before, now swirled with an unsettling intensity, almost like a language I couldn't quite understand, but that I could feel deep in my chest. I stepped into the darkness, my every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run, to flee from whatever awaited me in the unknown depths of this forsaken amusement park. But my legs moved forward, betraying my instincts, as though some unseen force were guiding me. I could feel the pressure of something invisible pushing me onward, urging me to go deeper into the heart of this cursed place. The door shut behind me with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine, leaving me in total darkness. I reached out instinctively, my fingers brushing against the cold, rough walls. The air around me seemed to thicken with an unnatural heaviness, like I was breathing something other than oxygen, something ancient, something that didn't belong. There was a faint hum, an energy vibrating in the walls, and in the distance, I could hear the faint sound of something scraping against the floor, slow and deliberate. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that I wasn't alone. A low, guttural noise echoed through the space, and I froze, straining to hear it again. There it was, closer this time. Footsteps, though distorted and unnatural, dragging themselves along the ground. The sound was agonizingly slow, as though whatever was approaching me was taking its time. I took a shallow breath and tried to steady my racing heart, my thoughts a jumble of fear and confusion. What was this place? What was it that I had stumbled upon? I moved cautiously, one step at a time, my senses heightened. The whispers became louder as I walked, now a blend of voices that seemed to overlap and intertwine. They weren't in any discernible language, but there was a palpable sense of desperation in their tones. They weren't just trying to communicate. They were pleading, begging for something, for someone to hear them, to understand their suffering. The darkness around me seemed to pulsate in time with the whispers, as though the very air was alive with the weight of their collective pain. The floor beneath my feet was uneven, as if it had been untouched for decades. Dust clung to every surface, and I could feel it settling on my skin, coating my clothes. The faint light from above barely penetrated the thick shadows that surrounded me. I could make out the vague shapes of what might have been walls or structures, but everything seemed distorted, as if the space itself refused to remain in focus. There was something wrong with the geometry of this place. It was as if the laws of physics themselves had been twisted, warped by something ancient and malevolent. And then I saw it, a flicker of movement ahead of me, a shadow moving swiftly across the wall. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, but the figure was gone before I could fully comprehend what I had seen. A chill ran through me, my body frozen in place as I strained to make sense of what I had just witnessed. Was it a person? Or something else entirely? I pressed forward, despite the growing sense of dread tightening in my chest. I knew I had to keep moving, that I couldn't stay still, or I would be consumed by whatever horrors lurked in the shadows. The dragging footsteps grew louder, closer, and I couldn't tell if they were following me or if I was merely drawing nearer to them. I tried to convince myself that it was just the echoes of my own movement, but deep down I knew that was not the case. Something was in here with me, something that had been waiting, watching. Ahead of me, a faint light began to materialize, weak and flickering like a dying candle. I pushed forward, feeling the faint stirrings of hope, even as my fear mounted. Perhaps I was nearing the end of this twisted labyrinth, the end of whatever nightmare had trapped me here. But as I approached the light, I realized it wasn't what I had hoped for. The source of the light was a dim, rusted lantern hanging from the ceiling, its flame weak and sputtering. Beneath it, a figure stood motionless, a silhouette against the pale glow. I couldn't make out any details at first, but as I drew closer, my heart stopped in my chest. The figure was human, but its face, if it could be called a face, was an unsettling mass of distorted features, the skin stretched unnaturally tight over its skull. Its eyes were wide, hollow, black voids that seemed to suck in all the light around them, a void that went deeper than anything I had ever seen. I took a step back, but the figure's head snapped in my direction, its movements jerky, as though it were not entirely in control of itself. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices screaming in terror, echoing through the space. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, its awareness of me, pressing down on me, suffocating me. The lantern flickered one last time, casting the room into darkness. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, the walls seeming to close in around me. I could hear the footsteps again, closer this time, more distinct, as if the figure was not alone. As I stood frozen in fear, I knew, deep down, that whatever waited in the dark beyond this door was not just a physical threat. It was something far older, far more dangerous. The park was not simply haunted. It was alive, and it had been waiting for me. A cold, wet breath brushed against the back of my neck, and I realized, with a sickening certainty, that I was no longer alone in the dark. In the wake of the chilling encounter with the figure beneath the lantern, I stood frozen, the stench of decay clawing at my senses. The darkness was more oppressive now, as if the air itself was alive, holding me captive in this grotesque place. The moment before the lantern's light extinguished seemed to stretch into eternity, the whispers around me growing louder, their sounds taking on an almost physical form, pushing against my mind with a force I could not understand. I had to move, but my legs were paralyzed, my heart thudding in my chest like a drumbeat. What had I gotten myself into? How had I come to this moment, where the very space I stood in seemed to be intent on unraveling my sanity? The figure was gone, but its presence lingered like a shadow that refused to dissipate, a phantom of my deepest fears. I had no clear understanding of what it was. Was it human or something else entirely? I wanted to scream, to break the silence that seemed to have descended upon the room, but even my breath felt muffled, strangled by the heavy air. The whispers grew more intense, their language incomprehensible, yet their meaning was undeniable. I was being watched, not just by the figure I had seen, but by something far older, far more malevolent. It wasn't merely a haunting. It was as though this place was aware of me, was feeding off my fear, feeding off my every doubt. As I tried to steady my breathing, I became aware of a subtle vibration beneath my feet, a trembling that seemed to come from deep within the ground. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew stronger, resonating through the very bones of the building. The floor beneath me shifted, groaned as if it were in agony, and for a moment, I feared it would collapse entirely. The space around me felt as though it were warping, stretching, as though the walls were alive, breathing in unison with the twisted whispers that echoed around me. It wasn't just the building that was alive. It was the entire park, every inch of it, pulsing with a dark energy that seemed intent on consuming everything within it. I couldn't help but think of all the stories I had heard about abandoned places, about places where the veil between the living and the dead grew thin, where something darker lurked, waiting for those foolish enough to wander into its domain. But this was more than that. The park, this forsaken amusement ground, had been designed for joy, for laughter, for excitement. And yet, it had become a prison, a dark reflection of its original purpose. The joy it had once given had twisted into something monstrous, feeding off the fear of those trapped within its confines. The park had not been abandoned by accident. It had been abandoned because it had become something else, something that could never again be part of the world of the living. With my mind racing, I forced myself to take a step forward, my feet dragging through the thick dust that covered the ground. My hand reached out, groping for something, anything, to steady myself as I moved deeper into the park. My every instinct told me to turn back, to escape, but the path ahead was no longer clear. The park seemed to stretch out before me like a labyrinth of twisted corridors, each more confounding and disorienting than the last. I couldn't remember how I had entered this place, how long I had been wandering, or even how to leave. Time itself felt distorted here, slipping through my fingers like sand. The whispers, which had once been distant, now seemed to swirl around me, rising and falling in volume, becoming almost rhythmic. It was as though they were following a pattern, like a song with a melody I could almost grasp but couldn't quite understand. It was maddening, this constant hum of voices. And then, through the haze of confusion, I heard something else, something unmistakable. A voice, a clear, distinct voice, cutting through the cacophony like a knife. "Help me." The words were faint, barely audible, but they were there, unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze once more. Was it a voice from the past, a lost soul trapped within the park's walls, begging for release? Or was it something else, something more insidious? I didn't know, but I couldn't ignore it. I followed the sound, my steps growing more urgent as I navigated the darkened path. The air grew colder with each step, my breath now visible in the oppressive gloom. The ground beneath me became uneven, and the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, distorting the space around me. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me, please. I've been here for so long." The desperation in the voice was unmistakable. It was a plea, a cry for mercy, and yet it held a note of something else, something darker. It wasn't just a cry for help. It was a call, a summoning. My mind reeled with the implications, but I couldn't stop now. Something about the voice, something about the urgency in it, kept me moving forward deeper into the bowels of the park. I rounded a corner and found myself in front of a dilapidated structure, its doors hanging on rusted hinges. The voice was louder now, coming from within. I had reached the source, but a sense of foreboding settled over me. There was something about this place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, that felt wrong. This wasn't a simple rescue mission. This wasn't a plea for help in the traditional sense. It was something else, something more primal, more terrifying. As I reached for the door, the whispers grew frantic, overlapping with the voice in a chaotic symphony of sound. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering above the door, my mind racing with doubts. Should I go in? Should I turn back? But there was no turning back now. Something was waiting for me inside that building, something that had been waiting for years. And as I opened the door, I stepped into the unknown, my fate sealed, whatever it might be. Inside, the darkness was absolute. But for the first time, I felt a flicker of something else, a presence. It was watching me, waiting. I wasn't alone anymore. Stepping into the room was like stepping into a void, an endless blackness that consumed all light and warmth. The moment I entered, the air became stifling, heavy and dense. It was as if the very fabric of reality itself had been twisted, pulling me into a space that was far older and more ancient than anything I had encountered in the park. The walls seemed to pulse, as though they were alive, and the sense of being watched intensified. I knew that the presence that had been following me, waiting in the darkness, was here now, in this room with me. I could feel it in my bones, a malevolent force closing in. The whispers, ever present, were now a low hum that seemed to resonate through my chest. The building itself had no clear shape or form. It was as if I had stepped into a warped dimension, a labyrinth where nothing made sense. The doors I had just passed through were already nowhere to be seen, swallowed by the shifting walls. The ground beneath me seemed to wobble, unstable, as if the very foundations of the building were on the verge of collapse. Yet I couldn't look away from the center of the room, where a faint glow emitted from beneath a thick layer of dust. Curiosity, that dangerous trait that had led me deeper into this place, tugged at me once more, pushing me forward. In the center of the room lay a strange object, a pedestal, worn by age but still standing firm. Atop it rested something that, at first glance, seemed harmless enough, an old carnival mask. Its surface was cracked, yellowed with age, but it was unmistakable. A jarring mixture of emotions washed over me as I gazed upon it. I had seen a similar mask before, in one of the park's old promotional materials. But this mask, this one was different. It had an unsettling aura, something sinister about it that made my skin crawl. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt its pull, as though it was calling to me. The whispers seemed to crescendo in volume, becoming frantic, desperate, and the voice I had heard earlier returned. "You shouldn't touch it," it whispered urgently, the words trembling with fear. "It's the heart of the park, the source of everything that's wrong." I froze. The heart of the park? The words echoed in my mind, but I didn't understand them. What did the mask have to do with this place? What did it mean that this was the heart of the park? My hand, though, moved of its own accord. Against every rational instinct, I reached for the mask, drawn by an invisible thread, as if the mask was in control of me, not the other way around. The moment my fingers brushed against its cracked surface, the room around me seemed to shift violently. The walls groaned, a deep rumbling sound vibrating through the air, as if the building itself was alive and angry. I pulled my hand back, but it was too late. The mask had already begun to glow with an unnatural light, and the whispers were now deafening, surrounding me, suffocating me. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet gave way, and I plunged into darkness, my body falling through the air with terrifying speed. For what felt like an eternity, I was weightless, drifting through endless black space. And then, thud, I landed hard, my body slamming against the ground with enough force to knock the wind out of me. I gasped for breath, my vision blurred, my head spinning. My surroundings were still dark, but now I could hear the sound of water dripping from somewhere far above, and the unmistakable scent of mildew and decay hung thick in the air. I pushed myself up from the cold, damp floor, my heart racing. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water and the echoes of my own breathing. As I regained my bearings, I realized that I was no longer in the room with the mask. I was in a different place, a vast underground cavern. The walls were lined with old, rusted pipes and machinery, remnants of the park's past. The air was thick with the smell of rot and rust, and the atmosphere felt oppressive, as though the very air in the cavern had been contaminated by something dark and ancient. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled forward, trying to find some semblance of stability. It was then that I saw it, a figure standing motionless in the distance. It was humanoid in shape, but it was shrouded in shadow, its features indistinct. Its presence was cold, ominous, and it radiated an energy that made my skin prickle. It wasn't a person. I knew that much. It was something else, something born of this place, a part of the darkness that had taken root here. I instinctively took a step back, but the figure moved toward me, its pace slow, deliberate. The shadows around it seemed to writhe and twist, bending unnaturally as if they were alive. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, their voices now a cacophony, as if they were urging me to stay, to watch, to listen. I could hear words, but they were fragmented, nonsensical. The only thing I could make out was a single phrase: "You've come too far." As the figure drew nearer, its presence overwhelming, I felt an icy hand grip my chest, squeezing tight, making it difficult to breathe. My heart hammered in my chest, but my legs refused to move. I couldn't run. I couldn't even scream. The figure stopped in front of me, its face still obscured by shadow. Then, slowly, it raised its hand, and I could see that it was holding something I had seen before, but I couldn't place it. The object was glowing faintly, and its shape was unmistakable. It was the mask, the same mask that had been on the pedestal. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of the situation. How had it gotten here? What did it mean? Why had the figure brought it to me? But before I could formulate an answer, the figure spoke in a voice that sent a chill down my spine. "You've awoken it. Now, you must finish what you started." The words lingered in the air, hanging heavy like a shroud that blocked out any remaining hope. "You've awoken it. Now, you must finish what you started." The voice that spoke these words had no warmth, no humanity. It was cold, mechanical, and filled with the unmistakable presence of something ancient, something bound to the heart of this forsaken place. The mask in the figure's hand seemed to glow brighter, pulsing in time with my racing heartbeat, as if urging me to understand the gravity of what I had unknowingly set in motion. I wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this nightmare. But my body refused to cooperate, frozen in place as if tethered to the ground by some unseen force. The figure remained silent, its face still obscured by darkness, its form only vaguely humanoid. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I could not see them. There was no escape. I was trapped in this cavern, bound by the curse that I had unknowingly unleashed. The weight of my own actions began to settle on me, the truth dawning with a crushing inevitability. The mask, the object that had drawn me in, called to me like a siren's song, was the source of all the darkness in this place. It had been the catalyst for the park's fall into ruin, the cause of the twisted, malignant energy that had seeped into every corner of the abandoned grounds. And now, I had awakened it once more, had set it free to do its work, its terrible purpose. The figure before me, its outstretched hand holding the mask, was a harbinger of that purpose, a servant of the darkness I had stirred. I tried to speak, to plead for mercy, but my throat tightened, my words strangled by the oppressive atmosphere. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering my struggle. Then it spoke again, this time with a slow, deliberate tone that reverberated through the cavern. "Do you understand now?" it asked. The park was never just a place of amusement. It was a vessel, a conduit for something far darker. And now, you've opened the door again. The words echoed in my mind, but I could not process them entirely. A vessel? A conduit? What could that possibly mean? I tried to focus, tried to make sense of the fragments of truth that were spilling into my consciousness. But my mind felt fractured, unable to grasp the enormity of what I had just learned. The mask, it wasn't just a relic, a simple artifact of the past. It was the key to something else, something far older and far more dangerous than anything I had imagined. And I had given it power again. The figure raised the mask higher, the light from it growing more intense, and I felt a shift in the air around us. The walls of the cavern began to tremble, the floor vibrating beneath my feet. I heard a deep, low rumble, as if the very earth was awakening, disturbed by the presence of the mask. The whispers that had haunted me since the beginning intensified, growing into a cacophony of voices, all clamoring for my attention, all speaking at once. Their words were incomprehensible, a mixture of despair, fury, and sorrow. But there was one thing I could clearly understand. I had made a terrible mistake. The figure seemed to sense my realization. It took a step closer, its hand still holding the mask, and I could feel the oppressive energy radiating from it like a storm cloud ready to break. It spoke again, this time with an almost mocking tone, as though it found some sick amusement in my confusion. "You think you can undo what you've done?" it asked, the words dripping with disdain. "This place is beyond your understanding. It was always meant to be this way." I wanted to argue, to shout at the figure, to deny what it was saying. But the truth was undeniable. I had come too far, crossed too many lines. The mask had not only awakened the curse of the park, but it had also bound me to it, tied me to its dark history in a way that I could never escape. The park, with all its twisted rides and decaying structures, was a reflection of something far worse, something buried deep within the earth, waiting to be freed. The figure's laughter, cold and hollow, filled the cavern, and I realized with growing horror that it was not laughing at me. It was laughing at the futility of my struggle. I was nothing more than a pawn, caught in a game far larger than myself. The mask, the figure, the park itself, they were all part of a cycle, a never-ending loop that would continue until its curse had consumed everything in its path. And then, as if to confirm my fears, the ground beneath me cracked open. The cavern seemed to shift, as if it were alive, the earth groaning with the weight of something ancient stirring beneath its surface. I heard a low, guttural growl, and a tremor ran through my entire body. The figure did not move, did not flinch. It simply watched, its eyes, hidden behind the mask of darkness, fixed on me, waiting. "Your time here is running out," it whispered, the words almost drowned out by the growing rumble. The heart of the park beats once more. "And now you must face it." I could feel the ground beneath me trembling, and I knew, with sickening clarity, that there was no escape. The curse of the park had been awakened, and now I was part of it. The mask, the figure, the labyrinth of decaying attractions. They were all pieces of a puzzle that I had unwittingly completed. The true horror was yet to come, and it was already too late to stop it. As the rumbling grew louder, more frantic, I braced myself for what was coming. The cavern seemed to close in on me, the walls narrowing, the air growing colder. I took a step back, but it was pointless. There was no way out. The darkness had claimed this place long ago, and now it had claimed me too. The cavern was no longer just a hollow void. It was alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the beat of my own heart. The rumbling continued, echoing through the ground like a distant drum, resonating within me with an unsettling force. The figure, still holding the mask, stood motionless, its presence now even more oppressive than before. The air was thick with an unnatural heaviness, as though the very atmosphere itself had become tainted by the curse that was seeping from the earth beneath us. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, more urgent, but the words remained beyond my grasp. It was as if the voices themselves were trying to warn me, but their warning was lost in the chaos that surrounded me. My senses were overwhelmed, and the weight of what I had learned crashed down on me. The park was not simply a place of forgotten memories or a decaying monument to a lost era. It was something far more sinister, something that had been dormant, waiting to be awakened. And now I had done it. I had brought it back. The curse was not a mere product of the past. It was a living, breathing force, capable of corrupting everything it touched, everything it consumed. The mask had been the key, the conduit through which the darkness flowed, and now it had latched onto me, binding my fate to the very heart of the park itself. I wanted to scream, to run, to tear myself away from the figure and its unholy influence. But my body was no longer my own. The air was thick with dread, and it held me in place as though invisible chains were wrapped around my limbs. The figure's eyes, those dark, abyssal pits, seemed to bore into me, seeing through me in a way that left me feeling stripped bare, exposed. There was no place to hide, no corner of safety to retreat into. I was trapped, and the mask, the source of all this terror, was now inextricably tied to my existence. "You felt it now," the figure said, its voice low and unyielding, like the growl of a beast waiting to strike. "The heartbeat of the park, the pulse that has always thrived beneath its surface. You've released it, and now it will never stop. It will devour everything in its path." The heart of the park beats again, and with it, the darkness rises. I didn't know what the figure meant by the heart, but a chilling thought entered my mind. The park was not just a collection of old rides and decaying attractions. It was a living entity, a monstrous, sentient force that had been bound here for centuries. The rides, the games, the forgotten laughter of the visitors, they were all part of a much darker mechanism, and I had become a part of it. The ground shook again, and I felt a deep tremor beneath my feet. The cavern walls seemed to flex and crack, as if they were breathing. The mask in the figure's hand shimmered, its faint light casting eerie shadows that danced across the jagged walls. I could hear a sound now, a deep, throbbing pulse that resonated from the very core of the earth. It was the heartbeat of something ancient, something that had lain dormant for far too long, waiting for a moment like this to awaken. Suddenly, the floor beneath me gave way, and I found myself falling. The cavern seemed to spiral downward, the walls blurring around me, as if time itself had fractured. I reached out, my hands grasping at the air, but there was nothing to hold on to. The sensation of falling was endless, as though I was plummeting into the very heart of the park itself. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the falling stopped. I landed with a sickening thud, my body slamming against the cold, damp ground. The impact stole the breath from my lungs, and I gasped for air, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart, amplified by the deep vibrations of the earth around me. I struggled to push myself up, my hands scraping against the rough stone, but the darkness pressed in on all sides, suffocating me. The faint light from the mask was still visible in the distance, but it seemed so far away now, as though I had been transported to another place altogether. As I regained my bearings, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The cavern was no longer just a cavern. It had become a part of the park. The twisted, decaying rides that had once been abandoned now stretched out before me, their rusted frames looming like skeletal remains of a long-dead past. The Ferris wheel, once a symbol of joy and wonder, now loomed overhead like a silent sentinel, its broken cars swaying in the air as though moved by some invisible force. The roller coaster, now a twisted maze of iron and steel, snaked through the darkness, its tracks like veins that wound deep into the earth. The heartbeat grew louder, more insistent, reverberating through the rides and the crumbling structures. The park itself was alive, breathing, pulsing with a dark energy that filled the air. I could feel it in my bones, this malevolent force that was slowly but surely tightening its grip on me. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices that spoke in languages I couldn't understand, their urgency rising with every passing moment. I stumbled forward, my legs weak, my body exhausted from the fall, but I couldn't stop moving. The park was calling to me, its heartbeat echoing in my skull, guiding my every step. I had no choice now but to follow it, to trace the path that had been laid out for me. The mask, still held by the figure, who was now nowhere to be seen, was a beacon, a symbol of everything I had unleashed. It was the key to the park's dark power, and I could feel its pull, a magnetic force that dragged me closer to it, deeper into the heart of the curse. And then, as I ventured further, I saw it. The center of the park, where everything had begun. The large, decrepit carousel, its horses frozen in mid-gallop, their once vibrant colors now faded and peeling. The music that once played on endless loops had long since stopped, but the sense of something stirring in the silence was undeniable. I knew, with every fiber of my being, that this was where the heart of the park lay. This was where the darkness had taken root, and where it would now be reborn. I had no idea what would happen next. Would I become part of the park's twisted history, another lost soul trapped in its grip? Or would I find a way to stop it, to break the curse once and for all? The answers were lost in the shadows, but one thing was certain. There was no turning back now. The heart of the park was awakening, and with it, whatever fate awaited me. In the stillness that followed, time seemed to slow. The carousel loomed before me, its faded horses frozen in eternal motion, a twisted parody of life. The air around me was thick with the pulsating rhythm, the heartbeat of the park that now coursed through my very veins. It was no longer an abstract force. It had become an intimate presence, a part of me. The whispers, too, had evolved, no longer frantic or cryptic, but now speaking in unison, a single voice that echoed with authority. Their words were sharp, cutting through the fog in my mind, pulling at the very fabric of my consciousness. "You were always meant to be here," the voice said. "This is where it ends, and where it begins." I could feel it, the overwhelming pull toward the heart of the park, the carousel where it all began. The mask, still a symbol of my torment, called to me like a distant echo, a reminder of the choice I had made to unleash the park's curse. It had always been there, waiting, silently drawing me closer to its ultimate purpose. I could not escape it now, not without understanding what it truly meant. I was no longer an outsider, no longer a visitor merely trapped in this nightmare. I had become a part of it. I had awakened it, and now I had to face what I had unleashed. The ground beneath my feet trembled, a low, ominous rumble that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth. The heartbeat quickened, synchronizing with my own pulse, each beat growing louder, more insistent, as though the very life of the park was tied to my own survival. I tried to move, to escape, but my limbs felt heavy, as if bound by invisible chains. The force was not physical, but psychological, a pressure building within my chest, pushing me toward the carousel, toward the heart of the park, where I had no choice but to confront the source of my torment. It became clear to me then that there was no escape. This place, this cursed amusement park, was more than just a haunted relic of the past. It was a living entity, a reflection of the darkness that existed within all of us. I had stumbled upon it by accident, but I had been chosen by something far greater than my own understanding. The park and everything it contained had been waiting for me, and now I was part of its cycle. I was its keeper, its prisoner, and its heir. As I approached the carousel, the whispers intensified, their voices now maddening, clawing at my sanity. The horses, once static, seemed to shimmer with a strange energy, as if they were on the verge of movement, as if they could spring to life at any moment. I felt my heartbeat in my chest, my breath shallow, the sound of it reverberating against the carousel's warped wooden frame. My hands trembled as I reached out toward the central pole, where the mask still hung, glowing faintly in the dim light. The mask's presence had been there all along, a silent witness to my descent into this nightmare. I knew that touching it would seal my fate, but what else was left to do? I had come too far to turn back. The mask felt cold, unnaturally so, as I gripped it with both hands. A shock of electricity ran through me, an overwhelming surge of power that made my entire body convulse. My vision blurred, the world around me spinning as the heartbeat of the park reached a fever pitch. I could feel the park's pulse, its rhythm intertwining with my own, and for a moment, I felt as though I was no longer separate from it. I had become one with the park, with the darkness that had always lain beneath its surface. But then, as the mask's power surged through me, I felt a sudden clarity. A realization, as if the fog that had clouded my mind for so long had been lifted. I understood what I had to do, and it was not what I had expected. I had been so consumed by fear, by the desire to escape, that I had failed to see the truth. The park, the curse, the darkness, it wasn't about survival. It was about transformation. The park was not a force to be defeated, but a force to be accepted, to be understood. I had to become a part of it, not just in body, but in spirit. I had to take my place as the park's new keeper. In that moment, I understood that the park was not evil. It was a reflection of the human soul, capable of both creation and destruction. It was the embodiment of every joy and every fear, every laughter and every tear. It had been abandoned, forgotten, cast aside, but it had never stopped being a part of the world. And now, I was its guardian. I would guide it into a new era, one where its darkness could be harnessed and understood, where its pulse could become a rhythm that matched the hearts of those who sought it. The carousel began to spin, slowly at first, but then faster, its horses jerking to life with a haunting screech. The sound of their hooves echoed in the cavernous space, a symphony of madness and beauty. The heartbeat, once a distant throb, now pounded in my ears, a constant, unrelenting sound that filled every inch of my being. I was no longer a victim of the park's curse. I was its vessel, its keeper, its new heart. And as I stood there, my hands still clutching the mask, I understood that this was my destiny. To become the embodiment of the park's pulse, to ensure that its dark rhythm would continue, undisturbed for eternity. But even as I accepted my fate, a part of me wondered what the future held. Would anyone else ever stumble upon the park? Would they, too, become part of its twisted legacy? Or would the park remain hidden, a forgotten relic of a past that could never be reclaimed? As the carousel spun faster, its music filling the air with a haunting melody, I knew one thing for certain. The park would never truly be abandoned again. It would live on, its heart beating eternally, and so would I. And so, the cycle continued, endless, timeless, and inevitable. The heartbeat of the park was now my own.